After facing intense pressure to condemn white supremacists, Donald Trump still has white supremacist champions working in the White House right now. Now, they call themselves alt-right. We call them white supremacists. Steve Bannon is the White House Chief Strategist who ran Breitbart News, which proclaimed itself as the home of the alt-right, which of course is a fancy name for white supremacy and xenophobic nationalism. Stephen Miller, who's a senior advisor for policy, is reportedly the mentee of white supremacist Richard Spencer, you know, that fool I destroyed here on NewsOne Now. And Sebastian Gorka, the deputy assistant to Trump, wore the medal of a Nazi organization to Trump's inauguration. Just last week, he said radical Islamic terror is the real threat to the U.S., not white supremacy. Also, a top person Trump wants to put in the USDA is Sam Clovis. Who is Sam Clovis? A birther. Who is he? Someone who has attacked Attorney General Eric Holder, who has used racial language as well. These are the people who surround Trump. Now, if they are still in the White House in this administration, do Trump's words really mean anything? Let's go back to our panel. Avis, I'll start with you. Again, when you look at that report, that has not been disputed, that Steve Bannon told Trump, don't go too hard against the folks in Charlottesville because they are a small but important part of your base. These are the folks who he has cultivated. And I think what people need to understand, these individuals are setting policy. They are determining public policy that impacts all Americans. And by the way, we're taxpayers, we're paying them.
We are paying them. And, you know, we see this in the outcomes of the policies that he has already pursued. Within mere days of being in office, he's completely pulled back any monitoring of white supremacist groups in terms of terror organizations in the U.S., only focusing on terror organizations who he described as having an Islamic focus. And so at the very beginning, they had this sort of payoff to these groups to say that we're not going to monitor you. They gave them a green light to increase their activity, and certainly that's what they're doing now.
Here's Sebastian Gorka saying, quote, it's this constant, oh, it's the white man. It's the white supremacists. That's the problem. No, it isn't, Maggie Haberman. Go to Sinjar, go to the Middle East, and tell me what the real problem is today. Go to Manchester. Brandon, here's the deal that's interesting. White supremacists have always told black people, go to somewhere else in the world. But black folks can stay right here. Yeah. Malcolm X wanted to go to the United Nations to bring America up on charges of racism. America has always wanted to live in denial of its true self. We've always wanted to condemn terror elsewhere. We've always wanted to condemn human rights elsewhere. But America has been shameful in ignoring its own history.
Yeah, agreed. And it's not just elsewhere. They tend to speak out on issues where they have a connection, but they've been kind of silent, some of the atrocities taking place in Africa. So it's not so much that they pick elsewhere, they pick places they have interest in. But you're right, they've this issue is long been seen in our republic. I think it's definitely hitting a new height in the recent elections for various reasons been mentioned earlier. But to your original point about staff in the White House, I definitely think that there needs to be some continued, I guess, adjustments to the personnel in the White House. To start with Reince Priebus, which I'm glad that is gone because he was not, I think, productive to the agenda. There are several other people who are in there as well, and I'm glad that there's other Republicans. Republican Congressman from Florida, Corbella, yesterday called out the need for Bannon to be removed from the office. And so I think you're definitely right. There definitely needs to continue staff reshuffling in the White House.
Don, I have been saying this, and people thought I was crazy in saying this. I said that we are engaged in what I call a 30-year war. I have given speeches, and I've told black people, you had better prepare for war. And what I meant by war, what I meant by that is, I'm talking about the fact that America is changing. When you look at polling data, which the question was asked in 2009, shortly after the inauguration of President Obama, are you optimistic about the future of America for your children? Every ethnic group in America. More than a majority said yes, except white Americans.
Right.
When the question was asked almost a year ago in a poll, are you optimistic about the future of America economically for the next 10 years? Every ethnic group, African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, high optimism. The lowest optimism, but the group with the highest wealth, white Americans. Right. And again, I need people to understand, this is not all white Americans. This is not most white Americans. And this is also not an issue where, and this is part of the problem, where we go racist, not racist. We have to contend with the fact that in between that is racial resentment, racial bias, prejudice, ignorance, you name it, that is informed by race. And in 2044, when we get to the point where no one group is going to be majority in America, that's the war I'm talking about. And we're seeing it with the attacks on affirmative action. We're seeing it when it comes to the voter suppression. It is here. And folks better recognize this thing is bigger than Trump, bigger than 2020. We're talking about literally the next 30 years.
For our kids, it's about the next 30 to 50 years. But you're very important to place. You're correct in placing this in an important historical context. This stuff goes back to 1964, the implementation of the Republican Southern strategy that came with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And LBJ told us very prophetically, we've lost the South for an entire generation. He was absolutely correct. When you look at the Nixon, which was produced by the Southern strategy, Nixon saying, I will never be out-Negroed again. When you look at Ronald Reagan starting his campaign as a dog whistle from Philadelphia, Mississippi, which was the home of the killings of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, that all leads us to the election of a Donald Trump. And we had a brief period, 8 years in power, as Ta-Nehisi Coates writes, but that is how we got here right now. But it's important to note also, I've practiced some civil rights law, and not only are these people sitting in the White House, but the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice are those who will be those who will be charged with prosecuting hate crimes. We have no reasonable basis to believe that hate crimes of this nature will be fully federally prosecuted. That will be investigated. An investigation, as we know, is not a prosecution. But when you've gutted the Department of Civil Rights budget, as Avis DeWeaver said, you've gutted the attorneys who are there and the research money to look into the actual institutions of these white supremacists.
But I need for us to push this back further. I need people to understand that it didn't start in the 60s. Now, the modern day battle, because when you look at people, I mean, Trump has even said it, when, the decline of America began in the 60s. It's a unique timing when it comes to the Black freedom movement. When you look at the rise of conservative foundations, think tanks, all a result of Brown versus Board of Education, all a result of Black freedom movement. But the reason this thing has to go back even further, you see the battle right now over the Confederate monuments. Okay, you see the mayor of Lexington, Kentucky, who is saying he's going to accelerate the removal of those monuments. You saw the toppling of the monument we had earlier. We have the video again. Pull it up, please. In North Carolina. You know, the Democratic governor said this is not how we should do it. You had, of course, a city councilman in Baltimore who's saying it's time to remove these monuments. You've got Newt Gingrich, who said on television on Fox News that the reason these Democratic mayors in these large cities are doing this to appease Black people. First of all, we got to remember it was about a 30 or 40 year period when there were no monuments after the Civil War. It was after Jim Crow. It was after Black folks were denied opportunities when white supremacists decided we are going to, for the rest of America, we're going to erect these statues to remind you Negroes your place.
Stay in your place.
That's the history, Brandon, of these Confederate monuments. So when these people come back and say, oh, this is recognizing our history, when you have the Republican gubernatorial candidate in South Carolina who says, I am proud of our Confederacy and our history, people have to understand this is not Republican, it's not Democrat, it's not liberal, it's not progressive, it's history of white supremacy in America.
It's America, and agree. And I'm glad you pointed that out, that it's not Democrat or Republican, because oftentimes there's a lens of that.
Because I read a few books.
Exactly. I just want to make sure we're clear on that part. You're right. I appreciate that. Some people get lost and make it always in that prison.
Well, I haven't.
Exactly. So I want to bring out to that point as well that this event over the weekend, they came together because they were trying to protect monuments in Virginia, and you had the sitting governor of Virginia, a Democrat, Terry McAuliffe, who has said repeatedly that monuments are a part of heritage and should not be taken down. So to your point, I agree 100%. This is not a Democrat versus Republican issue. This is about people on both sides
real quick, go ahead.
to this false ideology of American history that this is somehow about.
I object to that, Brandon, because at the moment, it is white supremacists who are supporting, writ large, the Republican Party. We don't have a space for them. We don't have a place or harbor for them in the Democratic Party.
No, Don, you are wrong. No, Don, there were Democrats, white Democrats, who were opposing Obama, who were in labor unions. There were white Democrats. No, Don, there were white Democrats who held racial resentment, who crossed the lines, who elected Donald Trump. What I'm saying is, here's why we can't play that game. It's because you can talk about monuments and white supremacy, but I can also talk about Democrats not spending dollars with black firms, less than 2%. Denying. So my point is this here. We have to step back when we talk about this idea of race. It goes beyond just an external extrovert view. It's also the soft bigotry. It's also the soft racism, and Democrats are just as guilty. Look at Bernie supporters who were condemning black people supporting Hillary Clinton. So I'm saying, I get your point, but don't act like Democrats can't be criticized.
And the Bernie-crats are condemning Deval Patrick and Cory Booker and Kamala Harris right now.
So what I'm saying is,
right on race, but the overt white supremacists, the Nazis, are not voting for Democrats.
And what I'm saying is this here, I am calling out all of it, and it's not just one party.
Weekdays on TV One.
I will never lie to you.
Oh my God.
Roland Martin.
He doesn't want to talk to us. He wants to ignore us.
Uncensored.
Hell no. That ain't gonna cut it, boo.
Unapologetic.
No, that is fundamentally false. You are wrong.
Unfiltered.
He wants an America where we all look alike. He ain't talking about black people.
Unrelenting.
You better go work out, because you got a fight on your hands.
NewsOne Now with Roland Martin. Weekdays at 7 a.m. on TV One.